Good morning, everyone. I'm so happy to have you here. You're going to have the best time in Sunday school today, getting to sing songs and listen to the story. And first, we're going to do a couple things just to get the wiggles out so you're completely ready. So we're going to wiggle our hands, we're going to wiggle our elbows, we're going to wiggle our shoulders, and then we're going to wiggle our head around. Wiggle everything. Okay, now we're going to take a big, deep breath. All right, now we're ready to enter the sacred space.
Good morning. It's so great to be back with you today. It is May 16th, the 7th Sunday of Easter. We have a great story today about Paul's travels and his letters. But before we get into the story, we'd like to look at the circle of the church year and see where the arrow is. And now, Kathleen has some great songs for us to sing. Kathleen?
All right. This is The Wise Man and the Foolish Man, and this song has actions. We're going to start with our fist like this, and it goes, the wise man built his house upon the rock. The wise man built his house upon the rock. The wise man built his house upon the rock, and the rains came tumbling down. The rains came down and the floods came up. The rains came down and the floods came up. The rains came down and the floods came up, and the house on the rock stood firm. And then the next verse is the same, except the foolish man built his house upon the sand. And instead of two fists, you have an open palm with your fist on top. So it goes, the foolish man built his house upon the sand, and so on. And then the rains came down, the floods came up, and at the very end it goes, and the house on the sand went smash. All right, so let's try it. The wise man built his house upon the rock. The wise man built his house upon the rock. The wise man built his house upon the rock, and the rains came tumbling down. The rains came down and the floods came up. The rains came down and the floods came up. The rains came down and the floods came up, and the house on the rock stood firm. The foolish man built his house upon the sand. The foolish man built his house upon the sand. The foolish man built his house upon the sand, and the rains came tumbling down. The rains came down and the floods came up. The rains came down and the floods came up. The rains came down and the floods came up, and the house on the sand went smash.
So, our lesson, as I said before, is about Paul and his travels and his letters. In the beginning, a baby was born. His mother and his father named him Saul after the first king of Israel. And they lived in a place called Tarsus, which was near the sea. And Saul worked with his father, who was a tent maker. And he loved to do that sort of thing. And even though they lived far from Rome and they were Jewish, they were still considered to be Romans. Maybe that's because his father made tents for the Roman army. The thing that Saul loved to do was to go with his father to the temple and to study Torah, the law. He heard many languages in the city of Tarsus, but it was the language of the Torah, the law, that he enjoyed the most. When Saul grew, and it was time for him to go to the great city of Jerusalem and to study. And so Saul left, said goodbye to his parents and his family, and traveled to Jerusalem. When Saul got there, he went into the temple to pray. And he became a student of the Rabbi Gamaliel, or one of the members of Gamaliel's family. And he studied the law, and he loved the law. And then he started hearing about, he didn't have a lot of patience for people who didn't appreciate and respect the law. And then he started hearing about the followers of the way, the disciples of Jesus who said he was the Messiah. And that made Saul angry because Jesus was a criminal, and the law said that cursed anybody as a criminal who was hung on a tree like Jesus was on the cross. And he sought ways to find the followers and to punish them. So Saul got a letter from the high priest to go to Damascus and find more followers of the way and bring them back to Jerusalem to punish them. And as Saul was going up the street leading into the gate to Damascus, suddenly there was a great white light, and he fell down, and he couldn't see. And he heard a voice saying, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" And Saul said, "Well, who are you?" And the voice said, "I am Jesus, the one you are persecuting." And the voice said, "Go into the city, and there'll be somebody there to help you." And Saul got up, but he couldn't go anywhere. He couldn't find the path because he was blind. And he went up the straight street, and he went into the house. And after 3 days, he had no food or water for 3 days and 3 nights. And after that time, he suddenly heard a voice. A man named Ananias said to Saul, "Saul, I am Ananias. I am here to help you." And when Ananias touched him, something like scales fell from Saul's eyes, and he could see again. And he had meal with Ananias, and after a few days, he had recovered. And now he was a member of the followers of the way. And he went to the temple to tell his fellow Jews about what had happened to him and how wonderful it was. But they wanted to kill him. But the followers of the way took him and hid him in the city so that the people, the Jews there, wouldn't find him. Then one dark night, the followers of the way and Saul came out, and at the top of the wall in Damascus, they got a basket and ropes, and they lowered Saul gently down to the ground outside. And then he went into the desert of Arabia. And he sat there in the desert and watched the desert, and he listened to the silence. And Saul knew what God wanted him to do. And Saul came so close to God, and God came so close to Saul, that Saul knew what he had to do. He was to travel the earth, to begin to start churches, and to write letters to those churches. So after Paul was in the desert and he knew what God wanted him to do, he walked and he traveled the lands and sailed the seas. He went to different places and started churches, and he wrote letters. He wrote letters to peoples in Thessalonica, to Colossus, and he even wrote to people in Rome. And he said one day he would come to Rome and then go on to Spain. And Saul returned to Jerusalem, and he met with Peter and James and other leaders of the Christians. And they eventually agreed that he should continue to teach to the non-Jews, to the Gentiles. And so that's what Paul did. And he went to the temple in Jerusalem, and the people started pushing and shoving him around. And the Roman soldiers came and fought off the people with their short swords and shields. And then they took him into the Antonia fortress, and they were going to beat him to find out why the people were trying to kill him. And then Paul told him, well, I'm a Roman and I must go to the Roman courts. And so that's what they did. So they took Paul to the town on the coast called Caesarea, and from there he took a boat and to Rome. And he sailed on the boat sank, but eventually he made it to Rome. And while he was in Rome, he was under a house arrest, and his friends could come and help him and give him food while they were waiting for the courts to decide. Some people say that Saul eventually did go on to Spain. Others say that he actually died in 67 CE during the great burning of Rome. I think Paul is still traveling and writing letters. So Paul became a story in and of himself, and his letters are read today in all churches. You can see a map of the journeys of Paul. And so this is the world as it was during Paul's time. And he lived, Jerusalem is down in here, Tarsus is up here in what is modern day Turkey. And Paul would travel to Damascus here, and then he traveled across the Mediterranean to all of these islands and various places in Greece, and finally he came to Rome. And when you come back to the sacred space, you can look at this chart and you can track the journeys of Paul. So I wonder, what part of this story did you like best? I wonder what part of this story is the most important. I wonder what part of the story is about you, or where are you in the story? And I wonder if we could leave out any part of the story and still have all the story we need. So that's our story today, this morning, about the travels of Paul and his letters. I hope you enjoyed it. We shall see you one more time next week, and have a great week and be well. Bye now.
I hope you have a great week at school this week, whether it's virtual or at school. And I hope you enjoyed all the stories and the singing, and we can't wait to see you back here next week. Please exit the sacred space, and we'll see you again.